America is no stranger to war, with all of the first settlements in the New World fighting for survival against not only the elements, but hostile Native Americans, many of which were masters of war themselves, and other Europeans seeking their piece of the New World pie. As the colonies matured, wars between themselves and the native nations set the tone for the dawn of American history. Soon, America itself became the object of the wars, and not just its movable bounty. These United States earned their freedom in war and continued fighting, westward into the boundless continent, and for respect in the Old World, the crown jewel being the inconclusive, costly, and in many ways foolish War of 1812 against America's most perfidious friend, Great Britain. Following the end of the Revolutionary War, Britain retained only a fraction of its population and land in North America, with the population of the new United States nearing 4 million per the 1790 census, and Canadian population estimates just barely reaching 200,000, the majority of those in Ontario being Tories, who fled America after the Revolution. Britain was understandably upset at the loss of their most economically active American colonies, and though opinions on America as an experiment in Republican governance were varied in the halls of power, the view that America was just a rebellious colony would remain, at least until 1812. The British would treat American traders with contempt, preventing trade with France and subjecting American vessels to random search under the pretext of looking for British sailors who deserted and began working on American merchant vessels. These searches often cast a wide net, and as the British usually had more cannons than the merchant ships, there was little the Americans could do when the British press-ganged 1, 2, or even half or more of their crew. On land, the British also sought to hinder America's western progress, using their position in Canada to supply the Northwest Confederacy, a desperate alliance of Native Americans previously pushed out of the Northeast and into the Great Lakes region, comprised primarily of the Huron, Iroquois, Shawnee, Lenape, Miami, Odawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe. The Northwest Confederacy occupied the lands of modern-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota east of the Mississippi. The Americans had been attempting to penetrate west of the Ohio River even before the Revolution, but following the defeat of the French in the 7 Years' War, the British enforced the Treaty of Easton, made between American colonial diplomats and representatives of the Mingo, Lenape, and Shawnee, in which the Americans agreed not to push further west than the Allegheny Mountains. The American colonists resented the British for this enforcement, and for Quebec being given administrative jurisdiction over the Ohio country. Following the Revolution, the only thing stopping the American colonists was their word to the natives. The first pioneers entered the Ohio Territory in force with the founding of Marietta in 1788. The founding also began the Northwest Indian War, in which the British not only supported the Northwestern Confederacy, but disguised themselves as natives and fought alongside them. The British also had a hand in supporting the Muskogee Creek faction called the Baton Rouge, or Red Sticks, a strong traditionalist group within the Creek Confederacy who controlled the Coosa, Tallapoosa, and Alabama rivers, receiving British support from their position in Spanish Florida. The war in the South began as a civil war between the Red Sticks, or Upper Creek, who fought American influence, and the Lower Creek, who Christianized, adopted European farming practices, and made big trade partnerships with American merchants. By mid-1800, the situation at sea, in the Northwest and South, began spiraling, coming to a head in 1807 when the HMS Leopard detained the USS Chesapeake off Norfolk, Virginia, taking 4 crewmen as deserters and hanging one as an example. This beyond bold move was seen by the American public as a challenge to American sovereignty, with President Jefferson failing to deliver a diplomatic solution. Congress passed an embargo on Britain, which, due to the nature of the American economy, only caused hardships for America, forcing American merchants to sell to Britain and vice versa through third parties, furthering international tensions. James Madison won the election of 1808 as the chosen successor of Thomas Jefferson, having served as Jefferson's Secretary of State through both his terms. Madison faced stiff opposition from within his own Democratic-Republican Party for his support of Jefferson's failed embargo, entering office with a scheme to not only end British harassment of shipping but French piracy as well, in a simple "I won't attack you if you don't attack me" deal. While Napoleon agreed to the deal, the British, seeking to maintain their blockade of France, obviously refused. As such, French piracy and British impressment continued. Following this breakdown in diplomacy, public opinion began to rather quickly shift to a pro-war stance, with the election of 1810 seeing pro-war candidates like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun rallying support in the Senate and House respectively. 1808 also saw the Shawnee chief Tecumseh reorganize the loose Northwest Confederation into a more coherent pan-native confederacy, with aims of uniting the disparate tribes under their shared heritage and with a new religion preached by his brother, the prophet Tenskwatawa, to resist American westward expansion. In 1810, Tecumseh and 400 warriors left their capital at Prophetstown, north of present-day Lafayette, Indiana, and traveled down the Wabash River to confront the governor of the Indiana Territory, General William Henry Harrison, in Vincennes, over the Treaty of Fort Wayne, signed between Harrison and members of Tecumseh's Confederacy behind his back. Tecumseh argued that the tribes had no right to sell that land, as they were one nation led by Tecumseh, and he didn't consent to the sale. Harrison balked at Tecumseh's supposed unity, and the debate grew very heated, nearly coming to a fight, with Tecumseh warning that unless the treaty was struck down, he would seek a formal alliance with Britain and would attack American settlements in the purchase. Harrison saw Tecumseh as a threat to not only Indiana's statehood but his own political career. The next year, while Tecumseh was traveling to treat with the Muskogee and Choctaws in the south, Harrison led 950 men up the Wabash River to Prophetstown. Harrison's army made camp on the Burnett Creek on November 6th, west of the settlement. Before dawn on the 7th, the sentries at the edge of camp encountered charging warriors, blowing Tenskwatawa's attempted ambush. Tenskwatawa was leading around 500 men, but a miscommunication with a band of Winnebago warriors led the ambush to become a disorganized melee. Harrison's troops, familiar with the native way of fighting, slept with their gear on or nearby and were ready when the attack came, fighting off waves of warriors until the native riflemen ran out of ammo, precipitating a retreat to Prophetstown, with the engagement remembered as the Battle of Tippecanoe for the river near Prophetstown, earning Harrison the nickname Old Tippecanoe. The next day, Harrison's troops found Prophetstown abandoned, the natives fleeing into Canada, a move that did not go unnoticed by the United States. On June 1, 1812, Madison sent Congress a list of grievances. Though he did not call specifically for war, the representatives debated for 4 days and passed the first declaration of war in United States history, 74-49. The declaration then passed to the Senate, where by 59%, the narrowest margin for a declaration of war in American history, war were declared on June 18th. In response to the declaration, members of the Federalist Party protested and criticized the Democratic Republicans. Sentiments between the two parties were so bad, Baltimore broke out into riots, with Democratic Republicans attacking the Federal Republican newspaper, tearing the building down with such fervor one man fell to his death from an upper window attempting to break it. The riot also saw gunfights, sieges of prominent Federalists' homes, and the jail where Federalists were taking refuge, the latter event leading to the tarring and feathering of local Federalist Robert Thompson, as well as the killing of the former Continental Army officer and prominent Maryland merchant James Lingan, with many others including Henry Lee receiving savage beatings of which he would never recover, all the while calling Federalists Tories and traitors, so you could say things domestically were tense. The declaration took some time to reach Britain, itself in political turmoil following the assassination of Prime Minister Spencer Perceval, merely a month previously on May 11th. His replacement, Lord Liverpool, sought a more diplomatic tract with the United States, but it was unfortunately too little too late, with the formal declaration of war reaching Canada by July 12th, taking even longer to reach London. Neither side was truly prepared for war, with Britain busy dealing with Napoleon, who was at the time crossing into Russian territory, with the British army occupied by the Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal, while the Royal Navy was pretty much all hands on deck maintaining the blockade of France, sparing fewer resources to deal with America. The United States, under both Jefferson and Madison, had practically disestablished the Army in accordance with their Democratic-Republican ideals of a weak as possible federal government, having only 12,000 regular troops in the whole country at the start of the war. Madison believing that he could rely on state militias to fight together. The situation in Canada would have been dire if America had an actual army, not to say things were going to be easy for Lieutenant General George Prevost, who, fun fact, was born in Hackensack. General Prevost had at his disposal less than 6,000 regular troops, and though he had the confidence of the Canadian public, it was not known if the French Canadians would care enough to fight for the British, or if the British settlers themselves, many of whom were United Empire Loyalists, having very close ties to America, cared enough to fight for Canada, a relatively new thing at the time. Congress immediately authorized the Army to expand to 35,000 regular troops, but with the state of the military America currently had, that was far easier said than done. Due to the unpopularity of the war, the general morale of the potential volunteers was low, and officers, most of which were aging out of service, due to the fact America hadn't fought a war in more or less 30 years, with the ones still kicking around usually busy making money, leaving Congress only the most dedicated and desperate willing to accept the low pay the Army was offering. Congress, being majority Democratic-Republican, were hostile to the institutions of a centralized federal army, opting to depend on the amalgamated strength of the various state militias. On paper, a force of nearly 500,000. That said, the paper strength of the American militias fell far short, on average being poorly trained, undisciplined, under-equipped, and lacking proper leadership, due to the aforementioned deficiency in the officer corps. If the situation on land was a problem, the state of the Navy was a tragedy, suffering the same chronic underfunding the Army had, despite the obvious advantage a strong standing Navy offered, with the First Barbary War fought between 1801 and 1805 in the Mediterranean being the premier example of the value of the Navy. The United States Navy at this point was purely for anti-piracy operations in order to protect American mercantile interests, and was composed primarily of medium-weight frigates and lighter ships, lacking any heavy ships of the line necessary for naval actions between the world powers of the time. Though the navy the United States did have was excellent in the quality of its sailors and marines, the sheer number of the Royal Navy, no slouches themselves, were practically insurmountable. In this instance, Congress as well relied on private interests, the American Merchant Navy, which would be turned into a privateer fleet, with President Madison issuing some 500 letters of marque, though these were more for disrupting vital British trade routes, and few privateers could or even would fight the Royal Navy unless absolutely forced. In Canada, Governor-in-Chief of British North America, Sir George Prevost, as previously mentioned, had less than 6,000 regulars in the whole of Canada to work with. That said, the regulars had the advantage, being far better trained as well as more often than not veterans of previous wars. As also previously mentioned, the Canadians were deeply on the fence about Canada as a concept, with most English speakers having close ties to America and French speakers generally apathetic towards the Crown. The militias of Upper and Lower Canada, numbering around 4,000, were on about equal footing to their invading neighbors in general quality, though home field advantage cannot be discounted. Canada as an entity had one final advantage, though, a history of defensibility. If you want more details on that, I have a 4-part series I'll link to in the description and up in the card. But for right now, all you need to know is that the French, to make up for Canada's relatively small population, relied heavily on some of the best and most advanced fortifications on the continent, from Ticonderoga and the pirate fortress of Louisbourg to the walls of Quebec City. Canada has always been a tough nut to crack. In the hands of veteran redcoats, this tradition of fortification would be a serious combination, one the Americans are ill prepared to deal with. Brigadier General William Hull, the first governor of the Michigan Territory, opened the conflict on July 12th by marching 4 regiments, 3 of Ohio militia and 1 of regular infantry, up the Detroit River in an attempt to capture Ontario. General Hull's troops were wholly under-equipped for the endeavor, not bringing any cannons, Hull fully expecting the Canadians to rejoice at their arrival and willfully join America. The invasion force was stopped at the hamlet of River Canard on July 16th, being defeated by the garrison of Fort Amherstburg and a few hundred native warriors. Over the next few days, more Americans would lay siege to the fort, but lack of cannons complicated any actual sieging. The next day, a group of natives, fur traders, and British regulars captured Fort Mackinac, whose garrison were unaware of the war, the first of many American losses. On August 8th, Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, Major General Sir Isaac Brock, arrived in the area with reinforcements to relieve Fort Amherstburg, prompting General Hull to retreat back to Fort Detroit and assume a defensive posture. On August 15th, General Brock and Tecumseh laid siege to Fort Detroit, unlike the Americans bringing artillery to do so. Hull, believing Detroit lacked the powder and supplies to fight off what he reckoned was a wild overestimation of British and native strength, surrendering Fort Detroit the next day. The surrender came as a shock to all sides. The Canadians eagerly equipped themselves with the surrendered American weapons, and Tecumseh's warriors began raiding American settlements in the disputed territory with relative impunity. The Americans reeled from the failure, Hull being court-martialed and nearly hanged but for the intervention of President Madison, returning home to Newton, Massachusetts, and keeping a low profile for the rest of his life. In October, General Stephen Van Rensselaer led a force of about 6,000 New York militia, regulars, and volunteers in an invasion of Niagara. Van Rensselaer was a competent organizer and political force in New York, the head of a prominent and well-connected family, rising quite high in the militia due to his station, but lacked the practical leadership experience required for the task ahead of him. General Brock, hot off his upset in the West, had spent the last 2 months fortifying the Canadian side of the Niagara in anticipation of America's next incursion. Van Rensselaer faced insubordination from within his own ranks. The Virginian Regular Army General Alexander Smith refused to obey Van Rensselaer at all and deployed his 1,700 regulars to Buffalo, refusing to join the massing American invasion force at Lewiston, further refusing to even respond to any of Van Rensselaer's communications. While Van Rensselaer's subordinates pushed for him to court-martial Smith, Van Rensselaer, mistaking bravado for confidence and not wanting to delay the invasion, figured Smith could handle himself. On the night of October 10th, Smith attempted to capture Fort George, crossing under the cover of darkness from Fort Niagara around to 4 Mile Creek, but failed due to inclement weather, marching his troops all the way back to Buffalo and ignoring further orders from Van Rensselaer. On October 13th, the Americans at Lewiston began to cross the Niagara, led by veteran Colonel Solomon Van Rensselaer, quickly coming under Canadian artillery fire. Despite the number of Americans, as soon as the shelling began, half the militia refused to leave their fortifications on the New York side, and one of the lead boatmen even fled downriver, taking most of the oars with him, forcing General Van Rensselaer to work with only 3,500 troops. The troops that did cross the river came under heavy fire immediately upon reaching the Canadian side, with Colonel Van Rensselaer being shot 6 times before taking a full step out of his boat. As day broke, the second American wave wasn't able to even get across the river, taking heavy fire and routing in a panic back to the American side. Colonel Van Rensselaer ordered a successful attack on a lightly defended battery slightly up the river, giving the Americans a toehold on the Canadian side. In response, General Brock led a bayonet charge of the position, receiving a musket ball to the chest from a lost American soldier. Following the loss of their commander, the York militia attempted to push on, but the Americans regrouped and repelled the Canadians, forcing them to fall back. By noon, more troops as well as General Van Rensselaer and his command staff crossed the river, with Artillery Commander Lieutenant Colonel Winfield Scott taking charge of the regular troops, and Brigadier General William Wadsworth attempting to reorganize the militia. As the Canadians regrouped at Queenston, they were joined by hundreds of Mohawk warriors who harassed and scared the Americans with their war whoops, greatly affecting them psychologically more so than doing any actual damage. General Sir Roger Hale Sheaffe took command of the Canadians, arriving with roughly 800 reinforcements and immediately attacking the American position. General Van Rensselaer returned to Lewiston to prod more troops across the river, finding not only would the troops not cross, but the boatmen refused to also. The cascading loss in morale, even worse across the river, and with the boats refusing to cross, General Wadsworth and Colonel Scott were forced to surrender. The high number of wounded on both sides led Sheaffe to propose a truce, to which Van Rensselaer agreed, sending American surgeons across the river to help the many surrendered wounded. With Van Rensselaer also tending his resignation, Alexander Smith was ordered to press the attack, leading a fiasco of an invasion at Frenchman's Creek before simply going home in the face of a full mutiny. Following the disaster at Niagara, General Henry Dearborn, the senior officer of the United States Army, led a disheartened third invasion from Albany. His troops got as far as the Lacole River, meeting a small group of Canadians and Mohawks on the other side on November 20th, with the Americans refusing to cross into Canada. In Part 2, we'll cover America's battles over the Great Lakes, the war in the South, the continued situation in the Northwest, and how the United States was running out of time, as well as the British preparing to strike back. Thank you for watching or listening. If you want to see the second part, the best way to do that is to subscribe to Mid-Atlantic Chronicles and hit the bell. While you're there, a like would be nice too. If you have a topic from American history you'd like to see, or just have something to say, feel free to leave a comment. It does help the video. Thank you again.